Now, medical experts reacted with alarm, says the text, on Monday, as two top contenders for the Republican presidential nomination appeared to question whether child vaccination should be mandatory, injecting politics into an emotional issue that has taken on new resonance with the recent outbreak of measles here in the United States. First, it was New Jersey Governor Chris Christie. He was visiting a vaccine lab, called for some measure of choice on whether shots guarding against measles and other diseases should be required of children. And then Rand Paul, he's a physician himself, Senator Rand Paul said,
I've heard of many tragic cases of walking, talking, normal children who wound up with profound mental disorders after vaccines.
Responding to his observation on CNN, the Dr. Gupta said,
No, there's no question. I think that it's dangerous, and to the extent that there's some pandering happening, this is the sort of pandering that can be dangerous.
All right. And then Obama on the Today Show, I think it was over the weekend, on the Super Bowl weekend, one of the reporters was granted access to the president, who said,
do you feel there should be a requirement that parents get their kids vaccinated?
Measles is preventable. I understand that there are families that in some cases are concerned about the effect of vaccinations. The science is, pretty indisputable. We've looked at this again and again. There is every reason to get vaccinated. There aren't reasons to not get vaccinated.
Are you telling parents you should get your kids vaccinated?
You should get your kids vaccinated. It's good for them, but we should be able to get back to the point where measles effectively is not existing in this country.
So, Dr. Lee Hieb, the president says the science is indisputable.
Well, this is nonsense. And before we talk about the specifics of vaccination risk, I think we ought to talk about some philosophy here. The first thing to say is the very same voices who are shrieking to support Roe v. Wade, giving a woman's right to choose whatever happens to her body, are the same people that are not giving her the choice to be vaccinated or not. You can't have it both ways. Either my body's sacrosanct or it's not. Second point, it is absolutely medically unethical to force anyone to undergo a medical treatment without their informed consent and without their agreement to the treatment. Let's face it. We've gone down this road before with forced sterilizations, with the Tuskegee medical experiments infecting black inmates, with the Nazis. We know about forced medicine against people's will. This is the Rubicon of freedom. We cannot allow this. This is just horrible. You can't mandate that people have a medical treatment. The other thing is this idea that the science is indisputable. I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but it's not. Science is never concluded, okay? Science is constantly changing. And somebody said, well, 97%, I think they were talking about client, 97% of scientists can't be wrong. Oh, yes, they can. Remember Galileo? And remember, they refused to look in his telescope because they knew what he was saying couldn't be true. So they refused to look, and that's kind of what's going on here. It's common in medicine that 97% of people are wrong, and one smart guy figures it out. Okay, we had this thing with ulcers. It was the standard wisdom that ulcers were caused by stress and food, and anybody who said something else was just vilified. The people that first came out and said it's a bacteria were practically hounded to death. They were laughed at. But they turned out to be right. Okay, so science is never concluded. In fact, the Journal of Cardiology looked at 20 years ago at their journal and said, how much of what we said then do we believe today? And the answer was about 50%. So it appears that the half-life of truth in medicine is about 20 years.
It's interesting that this language... Go ahead and conclude your thought.
Well, my last philosophic point. I got two other philosophic points, because I think this should conclude it. Quite frankly, we shouldn't have to be discussing the science. We should be discussing the liberty principles. If you believe absolutely in the protective value of vaccination, why does it matter what other people do? Just get your kids vaccinated. If you really believe it works, then I shouldn't care what my neighbor does. Just vaccinate my own children. See,
their argument is if you make that choice, then when there is an outbreak, you better not. In fact, it should be illegal for you to send your kid to school once the outbreak starts, because your kid is going to get the disease and spread it.
But why? If you believe in it, just vaccinate your children, and then they can't spread it to your children. You have the right to protect yourself if you believe that's protective. But I'm going to talk about that in a minute, whether it is or not.
All right.
And then the other thing is, if you think the government has the right to forcibly vaccinate people for the good of society, what's to prevent them from forcibly sterilizing people for the good of society, forcibly euthanizing people, forcibly implanting a tracking device for the good of society?
They're doing all kinds of stuff that the political class uses their power to inflict their way on all of us all the time. If you create a thought crime, your business can be over.
I know, but I'm just saying, people, this is really the end game, baby. And I just think I'm so incensed by this. I really think people need to wake up.
Well, I was looking at an article. They're using terms now, shortcut terms to describe people who dissent. They say like the truthers or the Tea Party, or Phil. And now they're calling people anti-vaxxers.
I'm an anti-vaxxer. And here's my point.
Okay.
I'm not I think of myself as a low-level scientist. I mean, I'm a physician. Traditionally, physicians were scientists. We know how to read the literature. At least we should. And I'm going to tell you, there's a ton of literature out there that you're going to have to convince me that isn't true before I think that all vaccines are always safe in all people. That's their position. I'm not saying there aren't some decent vaccines. What I'm saying is it cannot be true that all vaccines are always reliable and safe in all people. And, I recommend that people go to their sites. In fact, I'm actually writing a paper for WorldNet Daily on this, and I'll have all the references. But you can research this yourself. Here are just some facts that need to be taken into consideration. And I got these right off the CDC website and the VAERS reporting website. That's the Vaccine Complication Reporting website, which you can find at metalerts.org. There's a search engine for it. Basically, in the last 10 years, I look back 10 years since 2005, there have been no deaths in the U.S. from measles, but 86 deaths from the MMR vaccine. And 68 of them were in children under 3 years old. If you look at the complications in VAERS from the MMR vaccine, it's in children under 3. Now, I mean, most of them. There are some others going on. That doesn't include the hospitalizations, the neurologic complications that Rand Paul is talking about, the disability. I mean, there are like 2,000 of those. Here's another point.
Before we break, I need to take a short time out here, Dr.
And
Lee
this
Hieb.
is the measles vaccine.
Okay. The article said how to deal with anti-vaxxers. And, point 1, try to persuade them. Point 2, if that fails, give them no choice.
That's exactly what they're doing. But let me tell you, if they believe that about this, just everybody should pay attention, even if you believe in vaccines unequivocally. Do you want them to say this about other things? I mean, do you want them to force you to have a tracking device? Do you want them to force you to have birth control? I mean, where does this stop? If you're going to give the government the ability and the authority over your body, where does it stop?
Got it. Dr. Lee Hieb is on our Newsmaker line. We'll take a short time out, come back in a moment on News Radio 1040 WHO.
WHO.
A few more moments with Dr. Lee Hieb. We're talking about to vaccinate or not to vaccinate and who should say. I was looking at a news story this morning, Dr. Hieb. The question that was being asked, should a child be able to sue a parent for not vaccinating them?
Heck. I mean, look, as crazy as our legal system is,
yes,
if you've got government out of this thing, I'll take my chances with the lawyers.
Okay.
You know what? Let that be just a free-for-all. But you know what? Please do not let the government force this on us.
Okay, there's two issues. I would be remiss in not just asking you the basic question. If you had children of this age, would you have them vaccinated with MMR?
No.
Really?
No, I would not. And here's the issue. I mean, I think now, like I say, as a physician, there's an unknown risk of the vaccine, and there's a known risk of death from measles. At this point, let me tell you what they've discovered. There are researchers from all sides of the world, from both sides of the world, who have discovered that if you give children vitamin A, if you make sure they're well nourished and they have adequate vitamin A and vitamin D, they don't die from the measles. Okay, it turns out the complications from measles have more to do with the nutritional complement of the patient rather than it does probably from the actual virus. And we know this from other viruses, too. So honestly, I think there are other things to do. And in the United States, the risk of death from measles, the risk of complications is so low that why take the risk of the vaccine at this point? I mean, I have to say, I'm not convinced. The other thing to say is, now, things may change. You know, as patterns, what we're doing with vaccinations, we're changing the patterns of disease. We're now producing, for example, in chicken pox, and even to some extent in the measles thing, we're producing adult disease. You know, chicken pox is a good example. Chicken pox is generally a benign childhood disease. In well-nourished American children, it's generally not a huge issue. I'm not saying there aren't complications. There are sick kids that die from almost anything. But it's generally a benign childhood disease, to the point that in the old days, you had chicken pox parties. One kid in the neighborhood got it. Grandma and everybody brought the little babies over, the little tiny kids, the toddlers over, to get the chicken pox, because the common wisdom was true that the younger you got the disease, the more benign it was. Okay? Well, what have we done? We've now created a vaccine that probably is only protective for 15 or so years. So unless you're vaccinated every 15 to 20 years, you're at risk of getting this as an adult. And what happens when you get chicken pox as an adult? It becomes a big deal.
There is a huge... I can just tell you where assignments are going to escape us here, Dr. Hieb. Just reading the media tea leaves and the body language of the political class, they're going to make a real serious push about making this stuff mandatory. The seconds remaining...
If people don't stand up, we're going to be in real trouble. This is about your ability to keep your children. I mean, you asked me about vaccination. I ought to go to jail over this, because this is the end game of freedom. So this is the Rubicon.
Dr. Hieb, I appreciate your expertise and you giving us your clarity this morning. All right. Will that same 97% logic apply to climate change? We'll find out.